The autumn leaves had just begun their transformation from green to gold when Marcus Chen first noticed the rusted rails peeking through the undergrowth behind his property. He had lived in the small cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook, Oregon for nearly 5 years, walking the same trails with his dog every morning and evening, and yet he had never seen these rails before. It was as if they had emerged from the earth overnight, revealed by the retreating summer vegetation and the early autumn rains that had washed away decades of accumulated debris. Marcus was 62 years old, a retired Navy SEAL who had served his country for 28 years before finally accepting that his body could no longer do what his mind still demanded of it. The injuries had accumulated over time, like layers of sediment deposited by a slow-moving river. A shattered knee from a bad landing in Panama, 3 cracked vertebrae from an explosion in Mogadishu, a shoulder that had been rebuilt twice and still ached every time the weather changed. And the damage that couldn't be seen, the memories that ambushed him in the quiet hours, the faces of friends who had died while he survived, the weight of decisions that had cost lives and saved others in measures he would never be able to calculate. He had come to Oregon to disappear. The city had become unbearable after his retirement, the noise and crowds and constant stimulation overwhelming senses that had been honed for decades to detect the slightest anomaly, the faintest threat. His wife, Helen, had understood, had supported his decision to buy the cabin in the woods, even though it meant leaving behind the life they had built in San Diego. She had always understood, from the first day they met at a military function 30 years ago, to the last morning they had together before the cancer took her, 3 years into their rural retirement. Now it was just Marcus and Ranger, the Belgian Malinois who had been his constant companion since Helen's death. Ranger was a military working dog, retired like Marcus, with a service record that would have been impressive if dogs could receive medals and commendations. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, detecting explosives and protecting his handlers with a devotion that transcended training. When his handler had been killed by a sniper's bullet, Ranger had refused to leave the body, standing guard until rescue arrived, and then falling into a depression that the Army's veterinarians had never seen before. Marcus had heard about Ranger through a friend still active in the special operations community. The dog was scheduled to be euthanized, they said, because he couldn't be retrained, and no one wanted to adopt a military working dog with behavioral issues. Something about that story had resonated with Marcus, had reminded him of his own struggles to adapt to civilian life after decades of operating in the shadows. He had driven to Fort Bragg the next week and brought Ranger home. The first months had been difficult. Ranger was wary, aggressive, prone to outbursts that reminded Marcus too much of his own dark moments. But gradually, with patience and consistency, and the kind of wordless understanding that develops between 2 souls who have seen too much, they had found their way to each other. Now, 2 years later, Ranger was never more than a few feet from Marcus's side, and Marcus couldn't imagine life without him. It was Ranger who drew Marcus's attention to the rails on that October morning. They were on their usual walk, following the deer trail that wound through the forest behind the cabin, when the dog suddenly stopped and raised his head, his ears pricked forward in the alert posture that Marcus recognized from countless operations. Something had caught his attention, something that warranted investigation. Marcus followed Ranger's gaze and saw the glint of metal through the underbrush. He pushed aside the branches of a wild rhododendron and found himself looking at a length of rusted railroad track, partially buried in the forest floor, stretching away into the trees in both directions. He had known, intellectually, that there had once been logging railroads throughout this part of Oregon. The region's history was written in the stumps of old-growth trees that still dotted the landscape, remnants of the timber industry that had shaped the area a century ago. But he had never encountered any physical evidence of that history, had assumed that the rails had been removed and the routes reclaimed by the forest long before he arrived. Yet here they were, 2 parallel lines of rusted iron emerging from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature, leading somewhere that Marcus couldn't see. Ranger was already moving, following the rails with the purposeful gait of a dog on a mission. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before following. He had nothing pressing to do that day, nothing pressing to do any day if he was honest with himself, and there was something about this discovery that called to him, some instinct honed by decades of following leads and gathering intelligence that told him these rails were worth investigating. They walked for nearly an hour, following the old rail bed as it curved through the forest. The going was slow, the tracks often buried under feet of accumulated debris, or blocked by fallen trees that had to be climbed over or circumvented. But the general direction was clear, and gradually the forest began to thin, giving way to a clearing that Marcus had never known existed. The clearing was perhaps 2 acres in size, a rough oval carved out of the forest by human hands long ago. At its center stood a collection of structures that made Marcus stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was a village, or rather, the remains of one. There were perhaps a dozen buildings, their wooden walls gray with age and their roofs mostly collapsed. They were arranged in 2 rough rows, facing each other across a central avenue that was now overgrown with grass and small trees. At one end of the avenue stood a larger structure, perhaps a meeting hall or company store. At the other end, the railroad tracks terminated in a small yard, with the rusted hulk of an ancient locomotive standing silent and still. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene with the analytical eye of someone who had spent decades assessing terrain and evaluating situations. This was a logging camp, he realized, one of the many that had dotted the Oregon forests in the early 20th century. The workers would have lived in these buildings, cutting timber during the day and sleeping in cramped bunks at night. The train would have hauled the logs to mills further down the line, returning empty to pick up the next load. But something wasn't right. Marcus couldn't identify it immediately, couldn't put his finger on what was setting off his internal alarms. But he had learned to trust those alarms, had survived countless situations by paying attention to the instincts that whispered of danger, even when his conscious mind couldn't identify the source. Ranger felt it too. The dog was tense, his body language suggesting alertness rather than aggression. He wasn't detecting a threat exactly. He was detecting something unusual, something that warranted attention. They moved into the clearing together, picking their way through the overgrown vegetation toward the nearest building. The structure was small, perhaps 15 feet square, with a single door hanging open on rusted hinges and windows that had long since lost their glass. Marcus approached carefully, years of urban combat training making him check corners and scan for movement, even though logic told him there was nothing here but ghosts and memories. The interior of the building was surprisingly intact. The roof had collapsed in one corner, letting in light and weather, but most of the space was still enclosed. There was a rusted iron bed frame against one wall, its mattress long since rotted away. A small table sat beneath one of the windows, with a chair that had somehow survived the decades. And on the wall opposite the door, protected from the elements by a small overhang, was something that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. It was a photograph, framed and hung with care, showing a group of men standing in front of the very building where Marcus now stood. They were dressed in the rough clothes of laborers, their faces weathered and serious, their poses stiff in the way of people who were unused to being photographed. At the bottom of the photograph, barely legible after decades of exposure, was a caption, "Chen Lumber Company, Camp Number 7, 1923. Chen. His name was Chen. Marcus stared at the photograph, his mind racing. He had come to Oregon with no knowledge of his family's history in the region, no awareness that anyone who shared his surname had ever lived or worked in this part of the country. His father had been born in San Francisco, his grandfather an immigrant from Guangdong province who had arrived in America in the 1930s. The family history before that was vague, lost to time and the disruptions of war and displacement. But here, in this abandoned logging camp deep in the Oregon woods, was evidence of a Chen who had been here a century ago. A Chen who had owned a lumber company, who had employed workers and built camps and run trains through forests that had long since reclaimed the land. It could be a coincidence. Chen was a common name, one of the most common in China and among Chinese Americans. The odds of a random Chen being connected to Marcus's family were astronomical. And yet, Marcus had learned to trust patterns, to recognize connections that others might dismiss as random chance. There was something here, some thread of history that he needed to follow. The rails had led him to this clearing, had revealed a past that he had never known existed. He owed it to himself, to his ancestors, to find out more. He photographed everything with his phone, documenting the buildings and the terrain, and especially the photograph on the wall. He explored the other structures, finding more artifacts of daily life: rusted tools, broken crockery, the remnants of furniture that had once made these rough buildings feel like home. In the larger building at the end of the avenue, he found what appeared to be an office with a massive wooden desk still standing despite the collapsed roof, and a safe set into one wall, its door hanging open and its interior empty. But it was Ranger who made the discovery that would change everything. The dog had been exploring on his own, as he often did when Marcus was focused on something that didn't interest him. He had wandered to the far edge of the clearing, where the forest was beginning to reclaim the land, and he had begun to dig. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. Dogs dug. It was what they did. But Ranger's digging had a purposeful quality that caught Marcus's attention, a focused intensity that suggested he wasn't just playing or following a random scent. He was looking for something specific. Marcus walked over to investigate, and what he saw made him drop to his knees beside the dog. Ranger had uncovered the corner of a metal box, rusted but still intact, buried perhaps a foot beneath the surface. The box was about the size of a briefcase, with a handle on top and what appeared to be a lock mechanism, though Marcus couldn't be sure until more of it was exposed. Together, man and dog worked to unearth the box. Marcus used his hands and a flat rock he found nearby, while Ranger continued to dig with the enthusiasm of a creature who had found something worth finding. Within an hour, the box was free, sitting on the grass beside the hole they had created, waiting to be opened. The lock was rusted solid, but the hinges had fared little better, and Marcus was able to pry the lid off with relative ease. What he found inside made him sit back on his heels, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery. There were documents, hundreds of them, preserved by the metal box from the moisture and decay that had claimed so much else in this abandoned camp. Contracts and ledgers, letters and receipts, the complete records of the Chen Lumber Company from its founding in 1902 to its mysterious closure in 1924. And there were photographs, dozens of them, showing the people who had lived and worked in this camp over the 2 decades of its operation. Chinese workers mostly, their faces preserved in black and white, their stories written in the lines of their expressions and the poses of their bodies. Marcus spread the documents out on the grass, careful not to damage the fragile paper, and began to read. The story that emerged from those yellowed pages was one of triumph and tragedy, of ambition and injustice, of a family that had built an empire only to have it torn away by forces beyond their control. The founder of the Chen Lumber Company was a man named Chen Wei-lin, who had arrived in Oregon in 1898 as a young man of 22. He had come from Guangdong Province, the same region that Marcus's grandfather had emigrated from decades later, seeking opportunity in the timber industry that was transforming the Pacific Northwest. He had started as a laborer, working for white-owned companies that treated their Chinese workers as little more than disposable tools. But he had saved his money, learned the business, and eventually struck out on his own. By 1902, Chen Wei-lin had acquired his first tract of timberland, purchasing it from a bankrupt mill operator who needed cash more than he needed the remote forest that no one else wanted. He had hired other Chinese workers, men who had been excluded from better-paying jobs by racism and discrimination, and together they had built a lumber company that would eventually become one of the most successful in the region. The documents told a story of hard work and shrewd business decisions, of a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of early 20th century America with skill and determination. Chen Wei-lin had expanded his operations year after year, acquiring more land, hiring more workers, building the railroad that had eventually led Marcus to this place. By 1920, the Chen Lumber Company employed over 200 men and operated 5 camps throughout the Oregon mountains. But there were darker elements to the story as well. References to incidents that were never fully explained, mentions of legal challenges that seemed designed to harass rather than address genuine grievances. And finally, in the documents from 1923 and 1924, evidence of a coordinated campaign to destroy everything that Chen Wei-lin had built. The campaign had been led by a man named William Hartley, the owner of a competing lumber company who had long resented the success of his Chinese rival. Hartley had connections in local government and law enforcement, and he had used those connections to make life increasingly difficult for the Chen Lumber Company. Inspections that found violations where none existed, licenses that were suddenly revoked, shipments that mysteriously disappeared en route to market. The final blow had come in March of 1924, when a fire had swept through Camp No. 7, destroying the living quarters and injuring several workers. The documents suggested that the fire had been deliberately set, but the investigation that followed had been a sham, concluding that the Chinese workers had been careless with their cooking fires and that the Chen Lumber Company was liable for the damages. Within months, the company had been forced into bankruptcy. Chen Wei-lin had lost everything: his land, his equipment, his life's work. The last document in the box was a letter from Chen Wei-lin to his son, written just days before the bankruptcy was finalized, expressing his anguish at what had been done to him and his determination to someday reclaim what had been stolen. Marcus sat in the clearing for a long time, the documents spread around him, Ranger lying patiently at his side. He felt as if he had been given a window into a past he had never known existed, a past that was both deeply personal and disturbingly relevant to the present. Chen Wei-lin. The name stirred something in Marcus's memory, some fragment of a story that his grandfather had told him decades ago, a relative who had come to America before the rest of the family, who had made a fortune and lost it, who had died in obscurity while his descendants remained in China, unaware of what he had accomplished and what had been taken from him.
Could it be? Could this Chen Wei-lin be the same man, the forgotten ancestor whose story had been reduced to a vague anecdote passed down through generations?
Marcus needed to find out. He carefully repacked the documents in the metal box, adding layers of plastic bags he had in his backpack to protect them from moisture on the journey home. Then he and Ranger began the long walk back to the cabin, following the old rails through the forest, their minds full of questions that only more research could answer. The research took months. Marcus threw himself into it with the same intensity he had once applied to mission planning, spending hours at local libraries and historical societies, tracking down records and interviewing experts, slowly piecing together the story of Chen Wei-lin and the lumber company that had been stolen from him. What he discovered confirmed his initial suspicion. Chen Wei-lin had indeed been a distant relative, the brother of Marcus's great-great-grandfather, who had remained in China while Wei-lin had sought his fortune in America. The family had lost contact during the tumultuous years of the early 20th century, and by the time Marcus's grandfather had emigrated in the 1930s, all memory of Wei-lin's American adventure had faded to legend. But the story didn't end with Wei-lin's bankruptcy and death, which had occurred in 1926 from what the death certificate called natural causes, but which Marcus suspected was more accurately described as a broken heart. Wei-lin had a son, born in 1910, who had been 14 years old when his father's company was destroyed. The boy's name was Chen Ming, and unlike his father, he had not accepted the injustice that had been done to his family. Ming had spent his teenage years working odd jobs and saving money, nurturing a grudge that only grew stronger with time. When he turned 18, he had hired a lawyer with his meager savings and had begun what would become a decades-long legal battle to reclaim his father's stolen lands. The case had wound its way through the courts for years, repeatedly dismissed and repeatedly appealed. Ming had been drafted into the army during World War II, had served with distinction in the Pacific Theater, and had returned home more determined than ever to see justice done. He had married, had children, had built a life in Portland while continuing to pursue his legal claim with a tenacity that amazed everyone who knew him. And in 1962, after nearly 40 years of fighting, he had won. The court decision was buried in the archives of the Oregon Court of Appeals, a lengthy opinion that detailed the fraud and corruption that had destroyed the Chen Lumber Company and ordered the restoration of a significant portion of the original landholdings to Chen Ming, by then a middle-aged man with grown children and grandchildren who had never known a life that didn't include the shadow of this legal battle. But there was a twist. The land that was restored to Chen Ming was not the prime timberland that his father had originally owned. That had been logged long ago, its value extracted and pocketed by the men who had stolen it. Instead, Ming had been awarded a tract of remote forest that had never been developed, land that the court deemed equivalent in value to what had been taken, but which was essentially worthless from a commercial standpoint. Ming had held on to the land anyway, paying the taxes year after year, even though he could have sold it for a fraction of its assessed value. When he died in 1985, the land had passed to his children, and when they died, to their children in turn. The title had become increasingly fragmented with each generation, split among descendants who had scattered across the country and in many cases didn't even know they were part owners of this remote Oregon tract. Marcus stared at the genealogical chart he had constructed, the complex web of names and dates that connected Chen Wei-lin to the present day. If his research was correct, he himself was one of those descendants. His grandfather had been the nephew of Chen Wei-lin, which made Marcus a great-great-grandnephew of the man who had built and lost an empire in the Oregon woods. And that meant that Marcus, along with dozens of cousins he had never met, was part owner of the land that Chen Ming had fought so hard to reclaim. The land that included the abandoned logging camp where this whole journey had begun. Marcus sat in his cabin, Ranger at his feet, and tried to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. He had come to Oregon seeking solitude and peace, trying to escape the memories of a life that had demanded too much and given too little in return. And instead, he had found a past he never knew he had, a legacy of injustice and perseverance that demanded recognition and perhaps action. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The answer came to him slowly, forming in his mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He needed to find the other descendants, the scattered cousins who shared this inheritance without knowing it. He needed to tell them the story of Chen Wei-lin and Chen Ming, of the company that had been stolen and the land that had been partially reclaimed. And together, they needed to decide what to do with this legacy. It took another 6 months to track them down. Marcus used every skill he had developed during his military career, following leads and cultivating sources, building dossiers on people who had no idea they were being investigated. He found them in California and New York, in Texas and Illinois, in a dozen states across the country. Some had Chinese surnames, while others had intermarried and adopted names that gave no hint of their heritage. Some were wealthy, while others struggled to make ends meet. Some were aware of their Chinese ancestry, while others had been raised with no knowledge of where their families had come from. He reached out to them one by one, sending carefully worded letters that explained who he was and what he had discovered. The responses varied. Some were skeptical, convinced that Marcus was running some kind of scam. Others were curious, eager to learn more about a past they had never known. And a few were hostile, suspicious of this stranger who had appeared in their lives with talk of inheritance and land rights. But gradually, painstakingly, Marcus brought them together. He organized video calls where he shared his research, showing them the documents from the metal box and the photographs of their ancestors. He arranged for a genealogist to verify the family connections, providing independent confirmation of everything he had discovered. And he invited them to come to Oregon to see for themselves the land that had been fought over for decades and the abandoned camp where their history had been preserved by chance and circumstance. The reunion took place on a clear October day, exactly 1 year after Marcus had first noticed the old rails in the woods. 23 people gathered at his cabin, representing 5 generations of descendants from Chen Wei-lin's brother. They ranged in age from a 92-year-old woman who remembered hearing stories about the American uncle as a child, to a 7-year-old boy who was more interested in playing with Ranger than in learning about his heritage. Marcus led them through the forest, following the rails that had started it all. Ranger walked at the head of the procession, as if he understood that this was a ceremonial occasion, that these people needed to be guided to the place that would help them understand who they were and where they came from. When they emerged into the clearing, the reaction was everything Marcus had hoped for. There were tears and exclamations, hugs between strangers who were discovering that they were family. The oldest woman, whose name was Dorothy, but who had been born Chen Li Hua, stood before the largest building and wept, remembering a photograph that her father had shown her decades ago, a photograph that had been lost during a move, but which showed her grandfather standing in front of this very structure. They spent the day exploring the camp, sharing stories and making connections, discovering similarities in their faces and mannerisms that spoke of shared ancestry, even across the gulfs of time and distance. Marcus told them about Chen Ming's legal battle, about the land that had been reclaimed, and the decades of taxes that had kept it in the family, even when no one knew quite what to do with it. And then he asked them what they wanted to do now. The discussion that followed was long and sometimes contentious. Some wanted to sell the land, to finally realize the value that their ancestor had fought so hard to protect. Others wanted to develop it, to build something that would generate income for future generations. And a few, including Marcus himself, wanted to preserve it, to create something that would honor the memory of Chen Wei-lin and Chen Ming, and all the workers who had lived and labored in this remote corner of Oregon. In the end, they reached a compromise. A portion of the land would be set aside for conservation, protected in perpetuity as a memorial to the Chinese laborers who had helped build the Pacific Northwest. Another portion would be developed as a heritage site, with the abandoned camp restored and open to the public as a museum of Chinese American history. And the remainder would be held in trust for the family, its management overseen by a board of descendants who would ensure that future generations maintained their connection to this place. The Chen Family Heritage Foundation was established the following year, funded by contributions from the descendants and by grants from organizations dedicated to preserving Chinese American history. Marcus served as the first chairman of the board, bringing to the position the same dedication and organizational skill that had made him an effective military leader. Ranger became the unofficial mascot of the foundation, accompanying Marcus to meetings and events, greeting visitors with the dignified friendliness that had replaced his earlier wariness. The restoration of Camp No. 7 took 3 years, transforming the decaying structures into a museum that told the story of Chinese workers in the Oregon timber industry. Professional historians were brought in to research and document the history, creating exhibits that placed the Chen Lumber Company in the broader context of Asian American experience. The documents from the metal box were preserved and displayed, their fragile pages now protected behind glass where visitors could read them and understand the injustice that had been perpetrated against Wei-lin and his workers. The heritage site opened on the 100th anniversary of the fire that had destroyed the original camp, a date chosen deliberately to honor the suffering that had occurred and the resilience that had followed. Hundreds of people attended the opening ceremony, including descendants of the workers who had lived in the camp, local historians and politicians, and representatives of Chinese American organizations from across the country. Marcus spoke at the ceremony, standing before the restored building where he had first found the photograph that had started his journey of discovery. Ranger sat beside him, a calm presence that helped steady his nerves as he faced the crowd. 1 year ago, Marcus began, I was a man who had lost his way. I had served my country for nearly 3 decades, and I had come to Oregon to hide from a world that seemed too loud and too complicated for someone like me. I thought I was looking for peace. What I found was something much more valuable. I found a past that I never knew I had. I found a family that I never knew existed. And I found a purpose that has given meaning to my final years in a way that nothing else could have. He gestured toward the buildings behind him, toward the forest that surrounded them on all sides. This place was built by men who came to America seeking opportunity, only to find discrimination and injustice at every turn. They worked harder than anyone should have to work, for wages that barely sustained them, in conditions that would be illegal today. And when they finally achieved success, when they had proven that they could compete and win in the American marketplace, everything was taken from them by men who couldn't accept that a Chinese immigrant could be their equal. Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, until they found the faces of his newfound cousins, scattered throughout the audience. But they were not defeated. Chen Ming, the son of the man who built this company, spent his entire adult life fighting for justice. He served his country in World War II, even though that country had treated his family with contempt. And he never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the wrong that had been done would be made right. He didn't live to see this day, but his spirit is here with us. And so is the spirit of his father, Wei-lin, who built something remarkable in these woods, and whose legacy we are finally able to honor. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with the patient attentiveness that was his trademark. I want to thank one more person, although he has 4 legs rather than 2. Ranger led me to this place. He found the rails in the woods that brought me here, and he dug up the box that contained the documents that made all of this possible. Dogs know things that humans don't. They sense connections and histories that we're too distracted to notice. Without Ranger, none of us would be here today. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Ranger wagged his tail as if he understood that he was being honored. The heritage site became more successful than anyone had expected. Visitors came from across the country and around the world, drawn by the story of injustice and resilience that the museum so powerfully told. Schools brought students on field trips, teaching them about a chapter of American history that was often overlooked in traditional curricula. And researchers came to study the documents that had been preserved in the metal box, adding to the scholarly understanding of Chinese-American experience in the Pacific Northwest. But for Marcus, the greatest success was something more personal. The family that had gathered in Oregon that October day stayed connected in the years that followed. They held annual reunions at the heritage site, sharing meals and stories, and gradually building the bonds that should have existed all along. Children who had grown up knowing nothing of their Chinese heritage now celebrated it with pride. Elders who had kept family secrets for decades finally shared them, adding layers of detail to the story that Marcus had uncovered. Marcus himself became the unofficial patriarch of this sprawling family, a role that surprised him given how solitary his life had been before Ranger led him to those rails in the woods. He mentored the younger members of the family, sharing his experiences and his wisdom, helping them navigate the challenges of their own lives. And he documented everything, creating a comprehensive family history that would ensure the story of Chen Wei-lin and his descendants would never be forgotten again. Ranger lived to the remarkable age of 15, passing away peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning 5 years after the heritage site opened. Marcus buried him at the edge of Camp 7, in a spot overlooking the clearing where so much history had been made. The headstone read, "Ranger, he found what was lost." The family gathered for the burial, understanding that this dog had been more than a pet, that he had been an instrument of fate who had brought them all together. They shared stories about Ranger, about his dignity and his patience, and the way he had seemed to understand the significance of what was happening around him. And they promised to care for his grave, to ensure that future generations would know the role he had played in uncovering their shared history. Marcus lived for another 7 years after Ranger's death, serving on the Foundation's board and welcoming visitors to the heritage site until his body finally gave out at the age of 76. He died as he had lived, quietly and without complaint, surrounded by the family that had grown around him in the final decade of his life. His ashes were scattered in the forest near Camp Number 7, mingling with the earth that had hidden his family's history for so long. The ceremony was attended by more than 100 descendants, a testament to the bonds that had been forged since that October day when a veteran and his dog had followed some old rails into the woods. The story of Marcus Chen and Ranger became part of the heritage site's narrative, told to visitors as an example of how history can reach across generations to claim those who were never aware of their connection to the past. A sculpture was commissioned, showing man and dog walking together through stylized trees, their postures suggesting purpose and discovery. It became the most photographed object at the heritage site, a symbol of the journey that had brought so many people home. The Chen Family Heritage Foundation continues its work to this day, preserving the memory of the workers who built the Oregon timber industry and advocating for recognition of the injustices they suffered. The descendants of Chen Wei-lin gather each year at Camp Number 7, sharing meals and stories and maintaining the connections that Marcus worked so hard to establish. And the old rails still wind through the forest, a path that leads from the present into a past that is no longer forgotten. Some visitors claim that if you walk those rails on a quiet autumn morning, you can hear something in the wind. Not quite voices, but something like an echo of the past. The sound of men working and laughing and living their lives in this remote corner of the forest. And sometimes, they say, you can see something moving in the shadows between the trees. A dog, perhaps, with the alert posture of a creature who has found something worth finding. A guide who still leads the lost to the place where they need to be. Maybe it's just imagination, the power of a good story to shape what we perceive. Or maybe it's something more, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that the threads connecting us to our ancestors are stronger than we know. Either way, the rails remain, and the story they led to continues to unfold, touching lives in ways that Marcus could never have imagined when he first noticed that glint of rusted metal through the undergrowth.
The discovery that shocked a veteran became a legacy that connected generations. The dog who dug up a buried box became a symbol of the unexpected ways that truth can emerge from the earth. And the abandoned camp in the Oregon woods became a place of pilgrimage for a family that had been scattered for a century and was finally home.
That is the power of the past to shape the present, of the forgotten to demand remembrance, of the lost to be found by those who are willing to follow wherever the trail might lead. Marcus Chen followed old rails into the woods, and what he found changed everything, not just for him, but for the family he never knew he had, and the history that had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to discover it at last. The rails led him home, and in the end, that is what rails are for. They connect us to places we've never been but somehow belong to. They carry us forward while reminding us where we came from, and they show us that the journey is never really over, that there is always another discovery waiting just around the next bend. Marcus understood that by the time his own journey came to an end, and somewhere in the forest, watching over the land that had been reclaimed and the family that had been reunited, a veteran and his dog continue their eternal walk, following rails that lead forever into the woods, forever toward the shocking discoveries that await those brave enough to seek them.